in this particular scenario. Absolutism and relativism. Absolutism and relativism represent two extreme positions of ethical assumptions. Definitions. An absolutist assumption is one that believes that there are eternal rules that should guide all ethical and moral decisions making in all situations. Accordingly, in any given situation, there is likely to be one right course of action, right, regardless of the outcome. So an absolutist believes that this should be chosen regardless of the consequences or the cost. So that's why we're speaking about the absolutist or the dogmatic approach. A dogmatic approach to morality is an example of an absolutist approach to ethics. A dogmatic assumption is one that is accepted without discussion or debate. Right? So that's the first one, the dogmatic approach, right? Or an absolutist assumption. Right? So the absolutist assumes and believes that there are eternal rules and that should guide all ethical and moral decision making in all situations. Accordingly, in any given situation, there is likely to be one right course of action regardless of the outcome. So the dogmatic assumption is one that is accepted without discussion or debate. Relativist assumptions, on the other hand, are situational in nature. So relativist assumption, meaning that it is relative, depending on a particular situation. Relativist assumptions are situational in nature. Rather than arguing there is a single right choice, a relativist will tend to adopt a pragmatic approach and decide in the light of the situation being considered, which is the best outcome. So he will decide, if the pragmatic approach is to look at the particular scenario, what would be the best outcome. This will involve a decision on what outcome is the most favorable, and that is a matter of personal judgment. So these are the two. One believes that there are eternal rules. The other believes that this is a personal judgment. The outcomes of adopting either of these approaches. Firstly, the absolutist or the dogmatic assumption. If Anne were to adopt absolutist or dogmatic assumption, she would be likely to decide that she would need to pursue what she perceives is the right course of action, regardless of cost to herself or the relationship with the client or her manager. Given that she unearthed a suspect and unaccounted for payment, and that she received an inadequate explanation from the client, she would probably recommend extension to the audit beyond the weekend if she took a dogmatic approach. Now, if Anne were to adopt a relativist or pragmatic assumption, she would have a potentially much more complicated decision to make. She would have to decide whether it was more important ethically to yield to the pressure from Zachary in the interest of her short-term career interests, or hold out to protect the interests of the shareholders. Anne could recommend sign-off and trust the FD's explanation, but she is more likely to seek further evidence or assurance from the company before she does so. Right, so these would be the outcomes, more or less, if she took either of the two options. Now, the next model question we're going to look at, now that we have covered a significant amount in this first, the next one we're going to quickly go through is the supplementary, one from the supplementary pilot paper, question number 2, Franks and Fisher. Let's read the requirements first. So the requirements are: A. Explain with reference to the case the factors that are typically considered when deciding to establish an internal audit in an organization. B. Construct the argument in favor of appointing a new internal auditor from outside the company rather than internal audit in an organization, rather than promoting internally. C. Critically evaluate Mr. Kumas' belief that the internal auditor should report to him as finance director. And D. Define objectivity and describe characteristics that might demonstrate an internal auditor's professional objectivity. Right, so now that we know the requirements, let's read the scenario. Let's read the scenario. The board of Franks and Fisher, a large manufacturing company, decided to set up an internal audit and control function. The proposal was to appoint an internal auditor at mid-management level and also to establish a board-level internal audit committee made up mainly of non-executive directors. The initiative to do so was driven by a recent period of rapid growth. The company had taken on many more activities as a result of growth in its product range. The board decided that the increased size and complexity of its operations the board decided that the increased size and complexity of its operations created the need for greater control over internal activities and that an internal audit function was a good way forward. The need was highlighted by a recent event where internal quality standards were not enforced, resulting in the stoppage of production line for several hours. The production director angrily described the stoppage as entirely avoidable, and the finance director, John Comer, said that the stoppage had been very costly. Mr. Comas said that there were problems with internal control in a number of areas in the company's operation and that there was a great need for internal audit. He said that as the head of the company's accounting and finance function, the new internal auditor should report to him. The reason for this, he said, were because as an accountant, he was already familiar with auditing procedures and the fact that he had already had information on budgets and other control information that the internal auditor would need. It was decided that the new internal auditor needed to be a person of some experience and with enough personality not to be intimidated nor diverted by other department heads who might find the internal audits as an inconvenience. One debate the board had was whether it would be better to recruit the position from inside or outside the company. A second argument was over the limit of authority that the internal auditor may be given. It was pointed out that while the board considered the role of internal audit to be very important, it did not want it to interfere with the activities of the departments to the point that the operational effectiveness was reduced. Right, so that's our particular question. I want you to look back. I've given you a minute to read over the scenario if you hadn't got it. So let's reread the scenario. Once you have reread the scenario, then we look at our requirement again, and then the ideal, the standard solution. So let's look back at our requirement. It says, A, explain with reference to the case the factors that are typically considered when deciding to establish an internal audit in an organization. B, construct the arguments in favor of appointment of new internal auditor from outside the company rather than promoting internally. C, critically evaluate Mr. Comas' belief that the internal auditor should report to him as finance director. And D, define objectivity and describe characteristics that might demonstrate an internal auditor's professional objectivity.